Thank you all for attending our today's meeting, our March meeting in the PowerShell user group, building web-based IT tools with PowerShell Universal. So a big myth, where does our name come from? I have a map up here where we're located. Here is Munich, here is Salzburg, and here is our town, Burghausen. And if I zoom in here, we have here two rivers. The first one is the Inn, and the other one is Inn-Salzach. And if we see, we also see a castle in the logo, and that is because we have here the biggest castle in Europe, or one of the biggest castles in the world here. So that is where our logo comes from and where the name comes from. So a bit about myself. I'm Konstantin Hager. I'm a consultant, PowerShell enthusiast at a company called COC AG. We are about 200 employees. You can reach me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is COC, or at the Twitter handle of the user group. And you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn and connect with me. So today's speaker is Adam Driscoll. He's the founder of Ironman Software. He is PowerShell MVP, and he is the inventor of PowerShell Universal, PowerShell Pro Tools, and PowerShell Protect. So without further ado, over to you, Adam.
Perfect. All right, so I just have a couple slides I'm going to go through, kind of talk about what PowerShell Universal is, and then the majority of this demo, or this presentation, is going to be a demo. So this presentation is called A Tour of PowerShell Universal, and I am Adam Driscoll, the founder of Ironman Software. So we do make some things, including PowerShell Universal, PowerShell Pro Tools, which includes tools for Visual Studio Code, and some designers and that kind of thing. But today we're going to be looking at PowerShell Universal. So PowerShell Universal is a tool for building web-based IT tools, and it kind of allows you to build full-featured web apps with just PowerShell. So it's kind of broken down into three main sections. First are APIs, and APIs allow you to expose PowerShell scripts as REST APIs. And we're going to look at how to do that. You can kind of call whatever PowerShell commandlets you'd like inside your API, but then access it over an HTTP REST call. The second feature is automation, and this allows you to execute and schedule PowerShell scripts. So we have some some basic scheduling and execution things, but we also integrate really tightly with the PowerShell host, which I'll show you some examples of to kind of make it a little bit better experience for actually using PowerShell to execute and schedule scripts. And then finally, our dashboards. So these are pretty much the ability to create interactive web pages in PowerShell. And we'll look at how to do that. I'm not going to get really deep into the dashboard stuff. I'll show you some examples and that kind of thing, but there's a lot in the dashboard component. And it pretty much allows you to kind of display data or accept data from users and actually create pretty cool websites based on just PowerShell. For more of a rundown of kind of the list of features, here's like a slide of like a lot of the things we do. I kind of touched on stuff in the APIs, automation, and dashboard. We also have brought all of these under a single platform now, which is PowerShell Universal. So because of that, we can kind of take advantage of things like authentication, role-based access, the script-based configuration for all the different features because they're all under this single platform. So we're going to look at some of the basics of that today and kind of go through each one of the major features. This is a question I get asked a lot. I think this is kind of a branding problem on our end, is what's the difference between PowerShell Universal and Universal Dashboard? So Universal Dashboard was the PowerShell module that I created about 3 years ago, and it pretty much hosts an ASP.NET Core website inside your PowerShell process and allows you to create websites using PowerShell script in that environment. So what we've done is we've taken PowerShell Universal Dashboard and integrated it into PowerShell Universal. So PowerShell Universal is a little different. It's not a PowerShell module. It's actually a standalone .NET Core application. So that allows us to kind of stay up to date with the most recent versions of .NET Core and ASP.NET Core. It supports multiple environments, which means that you can actually use PowerShell 7 and Windows PowerShell in the same kind of instance of PowerShell Universal. There's no need to start two different processes. We kind of handle that for you. It does include the Universal Dashboard v2 and v3 frameworks. So if you've written PowerShell Universal Dashboard scripts before, there is a migration path to use it inside PowerShell Universal. It also has some additional features around advanced scheduling and job persistence. So we actually have a database where we are storing things like job output and that kind of thing, which is not available in Universal Dashboard. Our latest version right now is PowerShell Universal 1.5. Here are some of the major features that we added in this particular version. Some of the big things to note are that we support cross-platform, and now we've added Mac OS support, as well as a lot of Linux distributions and Windows. And then we've added script triggers, which is a big one, which allows you to actually trigger scripts based on things that happen inside PowerShell Universal. So with that said, I'm actually going to jump into the demo. So right here, I'm actually running VS Code. Let's make this a little bigger so everybody can read it. And I do not have PowerShell Universal running right now, but what I can do is I have the PowerShell Universal commandlet or module installed. So you can actually get this from the PowerShell gallery. And although it doesn't actually have the web server in itself, it is capable of pretty much communicating with PowerShell Universal and doing things like starting the PowerShell Universal server. So we have a lot of different ways to install this, but one of the ways to install is via the PowerShell Universal module. So when you do this, it's actually going to start up the Universal server. So in this case, I'm just kind of running it in the command line, but we have lots of ways to host this in Docker containers or as a Windows service, that kind of thing. But just as an example, I've just like started the server and it's just running the exe, and we're listening on port 10,000. Actually, I'm going to change that because all my demos are actually on a different port. So 5,000 instead. All right, so now my server is up and running. And once you start PowerShell Universal, you actually have this pretty much PowerShell Universal web server is now available. So as you can see here, I have a login page similar to what you'd see in Universal Dashboard. But what we've added with PowerShell Universal is an entire kind of management console. So on the back end here, you'll see that I have the various features. So I have my APIs, my automation scripts, jobs and schedules, dashboard features, and then some additional settings. So inside PowerShell Universal, now you have the ability to kind of manage this platform from the admin console. So if I were to create a new API, let's just create a new Hello API. And that will actually allow me to create an API that I can then call via an HTTP REST call. So let's just actually go ahead and return something from here. And if I save that, and you can actually execute it directly in here, and you can see that it returns hello. What's cool about this is if I copy this command line here for invoke REST method and then open a PowerShell prompt, I can call invoke REST method here, and it's actually going to return hello via the HTTP REST call. So that is actually going out. It's calling this this HTTP call and returning it, the PowerShell script here. So you can call whatever commandlets you'd like inside here, just because it's all integrated with PowerShell itself. So if I wanted to, go out to Hyper-V or System Center or Azure, I could do that inside this PowerShell script. So one of the big concepts that we have inside PowerShell Universal is the ability to configure everything with code. So although we have this nice management UI now, you also have the ability to kind of configure everything with code. I think, yeah, we're all set up. So as you see here, I'm actually using the PowerShell Universal Visual Studio Code extension, and it allows you to kind of hook up to your either local or remote PowerShell Universal instance and then manage it via VS Code. So what I can actually do here is if I click this open endpoints.ps1, you'll see that it's actually opened a file that is on my local disk here in program data, universal automation, repository, and then this universal folder. So what's cool about this is as you work through the PowerShell Universal admin console, it's actually generating PowerShell scripts in the background for you. But you don't have to work in that direction. You can also work in the direction of from the PowerShell script itself. So if I wanted to change this to say hello world, I could save that. And now when I go back to here, you're going to see that it's updated that PowerShell script based on what I changed inside the PS1 file. So PowerShell Universal is kind of watching its configuration directory, and when changes happen inside that configuration directory, it actually reconfigures itself so that now if I go back to my invoke REST method, you're going to see it's going to return that. So I didn't have to touch the management UI. I could just do this all in PowerShell script as well. So we've kind of added more or less a PowerShell generation tool in terms of the admin console. So while we're talking about APIs, I'm going to start to get into some of the features that we have available. And first of all, let's look at APIs. So I'm actually going to go and use the kind of the PS1 file here to actually start generating APIs for my PowerShell Universal instance. I've already created a bunch of these, and I'm just going to start adding them to this PS1 file. So this particular endpoint here returns is a get HTTP call, and it's listening at the URL hello. We also support many of the other various HTTP verbs. So for example, if I wanted to send data to the server, I would typically use a post method for HTTP. So in this case, I'm going to add a new PSU endpoint. The method is post. The URL is still hello, but in this case, I'm going to be able to send in pretty much data to the API, and then it's going to just return that back as this automatic body parameter that includes the text of the data that I sent. So if I do a refresh here, you're going to see that PowerShell Universal has picked up on the fact that I added a new endpoint. And if I click insert into console, it's actually going to insert that request in there for me. And then what I can do is I could add a body parameter and say, this is cool. And when I invoke that, it's actually calling this endpoint right here. And since I specified the body, this is cool, it echoed that back out to me via this PSU endpoint. So the other thing that we offer is the ability to kind of variabilize your URLs. So for example, there's a couple different ways you can do this. First is the ability to have route parameters. So in this case, I have an endpoint that has a route parameter, and that is kind of denoted by the colon here at the beginning of the route. And then what that does is it allows me to have like this automatic variable for that route parameter. So if I actually go ahead and call this particular endpoint, what I'm actually going to do first is I'm going to start a process. So we're going to start process notepad, and we'll pass through that notepad process to here. And now I have notepad running, and we're going to store the ID of that notepad process in ID. So if I want to execute this particular endpoint, and I want to actually look up that process by ID, you can see it automatically put that ID variable in there, which is going to expand to the notepad's process ID, which is this 25752. And when I call this REST endpoint, you can see it returns notepad. So it actually went up and it passed in that ID, and it passed it over to the get process commandlet, which then returned the name of that process. So in that way, you can actually, you can variabilize your endpoints. So we support lots of different ways of that, kind of standard things you'd expect in HTTP. For example, in this case, there's no variabilized route, but I could go ahead and I could add a query string parameter where I pass in that ID, and you'll automatically get that ID inside this endpoint here. Additionally, we support things like headers. So this is just kind of some of the basic configuration for endpoints. And as you can see, as I've been making these changes, it allows me to kind of quickly iterate on this because PowerShell Universal is reloading itself as I'm putting these parameters in here. And if I have the PowerShell Universal like module installed, you'll see that I have IntelliSense and that kind of thing. And we offer a lot more kind of options that you can specify for these commandlets. So yeah, so this is in kind of the example of APIs. We do a lot of other things with APIs, such as supporting passing like files and binary data. So if you need to want to upload files to particular endpoints, we have rate limiting configurations to kind of prevent overloading your server. Because one thing to note is that with everything running as PowerShell, PowerShell is not a compiled language, so you have to take some performance considerations into account. Kind of where PowerShell Universal is it can handle about 1,000 requests a second on solid hardware, depending on what you're doing in the endpoint. So that testing was done with pretty much nothing in the endpoint, for example. But yeah, so this is just kind of a great way to kind of glue together systems that might not talk PowerShell on both ends. Set up a PowerShell, REST API, and then call it from a Linux system that may not have PowerShell installed via curl or something like that. All right, for the next example, I'm actually going to go over to the admin console because it's actually a little more visual. So we're going to go to the automation section here, and underneath scripts, you can actually add PowerShell scripts to run. So with scripts, it's pretty straightforward, as you'd expect. It's like I want to run a script either ad hoc or on a schedule. I want to see output from that script. But we've done some stuff to kind of enhance the kind of experience because we're focused around PowerShell, so we can kind of take advantage of the PowerShell host. So to create a new script, you just click New Script, and I'm going to actually call this script Output. And we have some options around descriptions and what you want to do if there's errors. And one concept that we have in PowerShell Universal that I kind of touched on earlier was the ability to use multiple versions of PowerShell. So we have the ability to configure environments. In this case, by default, I have like what we have discovered on this local machine, which is PowerShell 7.1 and then Windows PowerShell. So I can choose which environment I'd like to run in. Environments also have some other configuration features like auto importing modules and setting variables and that kind of thing. But we're just going to use a basic setting here and create a new script. So now we have a script created, and what I'm actually going to do is just edit the script directly in here and call get service. So save that, click run. Going to ask me if I want to run in a different environment, but I'm just going to click run. And now it's actually running the job. And as you can see, it is outputting the pretty much job information via the kind of standard information stream inside PowerShell. If there's any errors and that kind of thing, it'll show up. And we use the standard formatting, so you can see that this looks similar to what you did actually see inside a PowerShell prompt, aside from kind of the stream it came from and a timestamp. But what's really cool is since we're like really integrated with the PowerShell host, we actually store the pipeline output as well. So for example, get service returns service objects, and service objects have properties, and PowerShell is an object-based pipeline. So because of that, we actually store all those objects kind of serialized as CLI XML inside the PowerShell Universal database. And you can see that then I can access lots of other properties of these particular items here. So you can, one thing you can do is obviously visualize them inside the UI here. But the other thing is we have commandlets for actually accessing job information via the REST API and that kind of thing. And that means you could pass these objects to additional jobs or to a dashboard or even to just like an external PowerShell process where you might want to look at the data that was returned from a job. So it kind of gives you just like a lot more information that you would get than on like standard kind of like CI environments that just kind of give you text. This actually stores them as objects. The other big integration that we do with the PowerShell host is we actually use the PowerShell AST to process the script's parameter block ahead of time so that we can provide contextual forms based on that param block. So I'm going to create a new script, and we're going to call it parameters. I'll click OK. And now let's edit this, and I'm going to put a param block in here. So I have a param block that has 3 parameters. The first one is a string. It's mandatory. It has a help message. The second one is a date time. Again, it has a help message, but it's not mandatory. And then finally, I have day of the week. So that's a .NET enumeration for all the days of the week, and that has a help message. If I save that, and now when I click run, what you're going to see is PowerShell Universal has actually gone in and looked at that param block, and it has generated this form based on that param block. So one of the things that we saw a lot with the Universal Dashboard was people were building forms, and a lot of them were just building forms for like simple stuff where you just need to input a couple things. So I'll show you a Universal Dashboard form later on in this demo, but for like simple forms where we don't want to have to actually like deal with the Universal Dashboard kind of form development or anything like that, this is one way to go, is you can just use Universal Automation to generate a form based on a param block. And then from here, you can see the help text pops up when I hover over it and that kind of thing. Select, date and time, and I have a drop down based on that enumeration. So some other things that you can add to forms like this are like checkboxes and time spans. I think we support PS credentials, and it'll actually allow you to integrate with the credential vault and that kind of thing. So now when I run this, it's actually going to pass those parameters into my script, and you're going to see the output from what I just typed into that form. And again, we store the pipeline output so you could actually access this via other scripts. All right, the final thing I want to touch on with automation is scheduling. So we're going to create another schedule or another job or script. And I'm going to call this just scheduled and create that. All right, and I'm actually use the burnt toast module here to actually pop up a notification when a script is run. So I think I have focus assist on, so we're going to turn that off for a second. And what this toast is actually going to do is it's going to say that it's running from Universal, and then it's going to pop up some text that gives the scheduled jobs ID. So there's a bunch of automatic variables that are passed into PowerShell Universal jobs, and one of them is the actual job itself, and then you get the ID of the job. So if I run this now, what you're going to see is, maybe it won't pop up. Oh, there it goes. Yep. So this was running from Windows PowerShell, running Universal, and this is scheduled job 3. So what I'm going to show you now is how to actually schedule this to run on an interval. And you can do that via the schedule drop down here, or by clicking this schedules page and clicking new schedule. From here, I can actually select scheduled, and then we have several options for scheduling. So first is kind of some basic simple schedules that are kind of common that people will use. And what this will actually do is it'll generate a cron schedule. So you can use cron-based, cron tab expressions inside your scheduler to do kind of more fine-grained scheduling. Like if you wanted to run every Monday at 9 a.m. or every night at midnight, you could create a cron schedule based on that. We also support continuous scheduling, which means that it will run and then it will wait a certain amount of seconds, which you can configure here, and then it'll start running again. So if you're like collecting data and caching it or something like that, you can kind of configure that there. And finally, we support one-time scheduling, so you could schedule something to run in the future. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm just going to set up a continuous schedule, and I'm going to click OK. So as you can see, I've created a schedule. It's going to run my scheduled script, and it's going to repeat with a delay of 15 seconds. So in 15 seconds, we should see a notification from Burnt Toast again. While we're waiting for that, I'll just kind of talk a little bit about some of the other features of automation. One being variables, so we can actually, define variables. Oh, there's my schedule. So that should happen again in 15 seconds. You can see I have standard variables, so you can just pass in variables, and those will be available in all your APIs, scripts, and dashboards. And we also integrate with the Microsoft Secret Management module, and you can actually define strings and PS credentials that you can store inside Credential Manager. Right now, this only works with Windows. We're going to be moving to the new version of the secret management module shortly. We were just kind of waiting for that to kind of settle down. And now it looks like they've released the final RC and they're going to be going GA soon. So this should work on Linux and with some of the other providers. Right now we just use the built-in Vault, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to use like Azure Key Vault and stuff like that directly in Universal, PowerShell Universal, excuse me.
Adam, one question, I'm not sure if I missed this. These schedules and the jobs, can I also control these ones using commandlets, or is it just the UI that I have for configuring them?
Yeah, here, let me show you. So I'm going to leave that there for now, and I'm going to turn on this. If you go back to VS Code, so first of all, you're going to see that all my scripts have pretty much been populated here. And if you go to this configurations section, it shows you all the configuration files for PowerShell Universal. And if you go to schedules and you open that, you can see there's my schedule. So this is actually everything inside Universal is configured with these PowerShell scripts, aside from like authentication and the web server kind of stuff. But yeah, so you can configure schedules via script.
Okay, great.
Yep. And then we also have a scripts PS1 that's been updated as we've been working through this. And this kind of includes like the metadata information for your script. So name of your script, path of your script, if you configured like it to run as a different credential or a different environment like Windows PowerShell, that would show up here. And then the scripts themselves are actually just the PS1 files that we were editing inside the UI. So and all that is stored pretty much within that local repository folder I was showing you. All right, so that is kind of what I want to talk about in terms of automation. So we do actually have, or the one last thing I want to touch on was triggers. Oh, I don't have a license installed. That's fine. I won't talk about that then. I'm going to turn this off so it stops notifying me. All right, so now that that schedule is deleted, let's talk about dashboards. So this is kind of where we've integrated Universal Dashboard into PowerShell Universal. So there's definitely some like architectural changes here that make it very different than Universal Dashboard, but kind of developing dashboards themselves is similar to what you would have expected in PowerShell Universal Dashboard. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new dashboard, and that's one main difference here is due to the way that PowerShell Universal works, we can actually run multiple dashboards using different frameworks between those dashboards. You know, running in different environments, you could have one running in PowerShell 7, one running in Windows PowerShell, and you couldn't do that in Universal Dashboard, but this allows you to kind of like host multiple dashboards depending on kind of your use case. So I'm just going to create a new dashboard called Dashboard. As you can see here, this is the framework I was talking about. We do support the 2.9 framework that was used in Universal Dashboard. It's mostly for backwards compatibility, and it's just receiving kind of bug fixes. It's not going to receive any new features. But PowerShell Universal has Universal Dashboard 3 kind of integrated into it. And that is a new version of Universal that is kind of built on top of a new client library that's made it a lot easier for us to kind of develop tools faster, that are less buggy, that kind of thing. So I'm going to turn on auto start and auto deploy. So auto start will start the dashboard when the server starts, and auto deploy will cause it to restart the dashboard process every time I make changes. So in a production use case, you might not want to auto deploy it. You can kind of choose when to deploy it to your user, that kind of thing. But in this case, I'm just going to turn on auto deploy. So when I do that, it's actually going to start up a dashboard process, and you can see it's starting right now. And if I actually click this view button, we're going to go over to the dashboard. And you can see here that I have a dashboard running. It's got a button and some text. It's got a dark theme switch button. And if I click this, it's actually going to take me over to the PowerShell Universal documentation. So how this works is if you come into your info here for this dashboard, you'll see that there's some PowerShell script defined. So I have a dashboard, and then within that dashboard, I'm using these like custom built commandlets for, kind of defining the components of my website. So Universal Dashboard could definitely be its own presentation completely. But in this case, I'm just going to show you some examples, and then we won't get into the weeds of all this, but just kind of understand that we can define highly interactive websites with PowerShell Universal Dashboard that both allow you to display data as well as take input from users and then perform actions when those users are interacting with your website. So in this case, we did have that text on our page, hello world there, and then we also had this button. And if you notice with this button, I wonder if I can zoom in on this a little. You can see that this on-click handler here is actually what is invoked when we click the button. So what you can do is you can actually integrate with other PowerShell commandlets to, take action. So when you click that button, it actually calls back to the PowerShell Universal server, and then it executes this PowerShell script, which in this case, it's redirecting the user to a new website. But you could do things like, work with other systems. So you click a button, it starts a VM, or you create a form and it adds something into Active Directory, something like that. So that's what our customers are typically building with this, is like highly interactive websites to build tools for kind of their organization with just PowerShell script. So I'm going to get through some examples of what we can do here and talk a little bit about some of the concepts around dashboards. So we've already touched on frameworks a little bit. So like I said, most of the time you're just going to want to use this V3 framework unless you're coming from an older version of Universal Dashboard. The other thing that we support are components. So we have several component libraries that are built in. So we have a charts library, we have a code editor, we have a map library that's really robust, a styling library, that kind of thing. But we also have a marketplace full of components that kind of our users have built that allow you to kind of install these components to add new controls to Universal Dashboard via right inside Universal Dashboard. It'll actually install these PowerShell modules from the PowerShell gallery and then save them to the components folder here so that you can use them in your dashboards. So for my dashboard, what I actually want to do is add a new component. So there's this components button up here, and I'm going to add the charts library. So I want to use some charts in my dashboard. And what that's going to do is, all it's really doing is automatically importing that charts module into my dashboard. And now we can actually go ahead and build a chart. So if I click edit here and paste some PowerShell script, this particular dashboard, what it's going to do is it's going to get the processes on the machine. It's going to sort them by their CPU usage, and then it's going to select the highest 10 CPU usage processes. From there, it's going to create a bar chart using new UD chart.js, pass in that data to this particular commandlet, and then it's going to use the data property of CPU for like the height of the bars, and then each one of the process names will be the label for that bar. So if I save this, going to go ahead, and it updated and redeployed my dashboard, and we've added some stuff to make the development experience a little bit better. And what you'll notice is it's automatically reloaded the page and everything. Like I don't have to do anything. I can kind of quickly iterate on that. And now I have a chart that has the highest CPU usage things on my machine, and you can see Microsoft Teams is the one. And yeah, so that is like how you can quickly add a chart with 2 lines of PowerShell script to display, you know, all the top CPU usage on your machine. Additionally, I kind of want to show off like the dynamic nature of PowerShell Universal Dashboard. So I'm going to edit this. This is a little more complicated chart, and it's using a different chart library. We actually have a couple chart libraries in our charts module. And what this is going to do is it's creating a dynamic section inside PowerShell Universal Dashboard. So this dynamic section will auto refresh at a 5-second interval, and it'll just like recall this PowerShell script over and over again, more or less, every 5 seconds. And then it's going to create a chart based on just random data. So I'm using a Nevo chart rather than a chart.js chart. Again, I'm using a bar chart with some, you know, configuration data here. And if I save this, it's going to update my dashboard here. And you can see now I have a new chart. It looks a little different. It's using a different chart library, but every 5 seconds, it's going to reload that chart data. So while I'm generating random data here, this could go out to some system and, you know, get process information or, you know, call some REST API to return some data into this chart. And you'll notice that we have like animation and that kind of thing to make it kind of look nice. And that is accomplished because we're using a front-end JavaScript framework called React, which kind of allows us to easily update controls in a way that allows the React component developer to do things like this with cool animation and stuff. And you don't really have to worry about that. As long as the component like supports this kind of thing, you're just going to kind of you know, take advantage of that in your dashboards. All right, so sorry, go ahead. Sorry, I missed that. Was there a question? No, okay. So as you can imagine, we can do all kinds of things. So charts are one thing. You know, you obviously can do text and tables. Anything you could pretty much do in HTML, you can kind of do inside PowerShell Universal. I am going to switch this a little bit and kind of look at this from another perspective where you could actually take data from a user and perform some actions. So one big change we made in the Universal Dashboard v3 framework was we implemented a new kind of form control that is easier to use and a lot more powerful. And I'll just show you some examples of that. So get rid of this chart, and I'm actually going to put in a new UD form here. And what this is going to do is it has kind of 2 script blocks that you need to define. The first is a content script block, which is the actual like visual layout of the form. In this case, I just have 2 text boxes, or I mean 1 text box and a checkbox. And then I have an onSubmit script block, and that is actually what's invoked when the form is actually submitted. So what we're going to do is just kind of pop up 2 toast messages when this form is committed. So I'm going to save that. And that is going to reload my dashboard. And now you can see I have a form here, real simple form. There's lots of configuration options you can do with forms. But in this case, you could just enter some data, check this checkbox, and then click submit. And you'll see that I get these little pop-ups. So that's actually calling back to that PowerShell script and invoking that PowerShell script with the arguments from this form. So as you can imagine, you can build forms for all kinds of things. And I'm going to show you kind of, we're starting to put together some kind of purpose-built solutions for some of these forms because we have a lot of customers that are doing things like Active Directory password reset and that kind of thing. And right now, although you can build the form yourself, we're trying to like kind of build out some of that at least as examples kind of thing. So one of the cool benefits of the new version of kind of the input controls in Universal Dashboard v3 is the ability to kind of really mess with your form. So as you can see, this is a very simple form. It doesn't like manage any of the like layout or anything like that. But Universal Dashboard has all kinds of layout controls and display controls. So in this form, for example, what I'm doing is I'm actually creating a form that's kind of laid out specifically for however I want it. In this case, I have a row with several columns, and then those columns have text boxes. I have a text box that's not in any rows or columns, and then I have some more text boxes that are in rows and columns. And then from there, I can, again, call submit. And if I save that, you're going to see that I have a kind of a formatted form. It should be formatted. Yeah, a formatted form based on what I defined inside that particular script. And as you can tell, like when I was zoomed in, it actually readjusted. That's because we have the UI library we're using is actually designed to adapt based on the size of your screen. So smaller screens should adapt so that they look correct and they're actually accessible, like on your phone or something like that. All right, I want to touch on a little custom components. Like I mentioned just before, we're trying to start to focus on kind of purpose-built components to make it easier for our customers to get up and going without having to write all this yourself. So as you can imagine, there's a lot to learn. It's very powerful, and people have built some very amazing things with Universal Dashboard. But what we're starting to look towards is making it easier and easier for people to build dashboards themselves without actually having to learn too much about Universal Dashboard. So we're making some investments in the marketplace, and what you're going to notice, some of our most recent modules are focused around actual technologies, so like Azure, Windows, Active Directory, monitoring, SQL, network. So we're going to start building these out so that we make it real easy for people to kind of integrate with these things. So I'm going to show an example of the Universal Dashboard SQL table. So I'm going to install this particular component. And what this is actually doing is it's calling save module from the gallery, and it's actually saving this PowerShell module down into my components directory. And that component's been saved. And if I actually go back to the components page, you'll see that it's listed here. And now if I go back to my dashboard, I can actually go to info and add my SQL component here. So now that will actually load up that particular component directly into my dashboard. And to kind of give you an example of how we're trying to make this easier is I'm going to create a table based on a SQL query. So inside that module, we have this commandlet called new UD SQL table. And it has some parameters like the query to actually query the data that we want from SQL, the count query to see, how many records based on this particular table we have, and then the SQL instance and database. There are some additional parameters for credentials and stuff, but I'm just using integrated authentication here, so this is just going to work without that. So if I save that, it's going to restart my dashboard, and you'll see a table load. And what it's actually doing is it's going out to the SQL server, and the first time it takes a second. And you can see here, I am actually querying this data from that SQL server. So it didn't just go out and grab all the records. It actually grabbed just the number of records in the page. So that particular commandlet, the new UD SQL table, will actually generate things like the where statements and the paging and all that stuff, as long as you pass in those basic queries. And then from there, Universal Dashboard actually has the ability to do kind of server-side paging, searching, and sorting. So if I click on this next page, what it's actually done there is it didn't page that locally inside the web browser. It actually went and made a SQL query and moved to the next page in that table. And the same goes for things like sorting. So it's actually going out and it's sorting at the SQL level rather than sorting kind of at the PowerShell level. So, if you had more than 14 records, this would probably be kind of the way to go. Like if you had a couple thousand records that you wanted your user to look through, we're trying to make it real easy for people to just kind of plop this on their page, integrate with a SQL database, and then kind of display this, right in PowerShell Universal Dashboard without having to write all that by hand. You can kind of do it with almost a one-liner if you didn't do the splatting that I did here. So that's kind of our next goal, is try to start focusing on some of those custom-built components. So all those components are actually available on GitHub. So the other thing that we kind of want to do with those components are provide really good examples. So if you go to the project page here, you're going to see on our PowerShell Universal website, all these components are available here. So if you did want to look at how that particular SQL table commandlet was created, it's just available here as this PowerShell script that pretty much uses DBA tools and the PowerShell Universal Dashboard table control to create that table that works at a server-side kind of way. All right, so I think, excuse me, I think from a demo perspective, that is kind of what I was going for. And I want to talk just a little bit about what we're going for in PowerShell Universal 1.6. So the first thing that we're doing is we have kind of re-architected the admin console. This is more of a technical debt problem that we had. It may seem like the dashboard or the console is very fast on a local machine like the one I'm using here, but the actual client-side JavaScript is very large and very slow if you're doing it over a network that's kind of slow. So we're working on trimming that down, making it really fast and making it easy to maintain so that you can kind of speed up in terms of fixing things and adding features without having to spend too much time working on that actual JavaScript code. The other thing is we're improving the roles for jobs, because right now you can assign things like operator and executor roles, but you can't actually manipulate the permissions for individual scripts. And we have customers that want, certain scripts for certain users and only viewing certain scripts and that kind of thing. So we're working on improving the roles for jobs. Another kind of technical thing is that we've migrated to LightDB v5, which is the single file database that we're using to store job data and that kind of thing. The version 4 was starting to have some problems with large output, so we're moving over to that. So it'll be faster and I think more resilient. And then finally, we're rolling out a plugin system. So while this might not yet be something that a PowerShell Universal user may use, kind of what we're hoping to do is Universal Dashboard has a great extensibility story in terms of building out custom controls with React or just PowerShell script. But we also want to have a good extensibility story for Universal itself. So kind of where we're starting with the plugin system is database support. So we want to be able to plug in SQL Server support for storing job data, and we have customers that want MySQL support, that kind of thing. So that's kind of one place we're looking, and then as well as logging and some authentication plugin system stuff. So we have the basics kind of implemented for that, and we're not going to go too crazy with that yet, but we're going to kind of building a foundation for a more extensible PowerShell Universal. And then you can kind of plug in what you want, and you don't have to just download this huge thing that has all these features that you might not totally need. And one other thing I just wanted to mention before I kind of open up to questions is everything I showed you today is just free to use. So I did not have a license installed or anything. We have some limitations on the number of endpoints you can have and the number of jobs you can run per day if you don't have a license, but you can build some pretty cool stuff without having to actually purchase this at all. So just trying to get people up and running and seeing what they can kind of do with PowerShell Universal. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions.
Adam, can you hear me again?
Yep, I can.
Perfect, because I had some audio issues after I hit record. That's very stupid. Thank you for the presentation. Very good presentation. Does any one of the participants have some questions? If not, I will get some questions for Adam.
I've got one about using the API. Why would you want to use the API instead of just why would you want to be using that? I just don't fully get what the benefit of the universal API is.
We've had a lot of customers that have like real big investment in PowerShell, and they just want to take their existing PowerShell modules and then access them from kind of heterogeneous systems, I guess. I think I think my favorite example of someone using the API is we have a trucking company that they actually, they automate most of their environment with PowerShell and some SQL geospatial data, and then they have computers within their trucks that have these embedded systems that can't, you can't install PowerShell on it or anything like that. They actually call back to the API via that to execute the PowerShell script to update the SQL. So it was mostly because they're a small trucking company. They don't know a lot, or they don't have like the knowledge in-house for building out REST APIs, but they do have the knowledge in-house for PowerShell. So that's kind of like one example that comes to mind.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the question. Are there some other questions for Adam? Okay, no questions. I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
In prior versions of PowerShell Universal Dashboard, like the 2.9 timeframe or so, there was a endpoint, the new UD endpoint commandlet, where you can preload some data into the dashboard before running the actual dashboard.
Mm-hmm.
I read through the documentation, which is really good, by the way, and I saw a commandlet which was about the new PSU cache, I think it is called.
Mm-hmm.
Can I use that to preload data, or should I use the automation engine to trigger a script to get the data that I need, or what do you prefer in that situation?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways you can go. So we still actually do support the new UD endpoint stuff. So like if you did want to do like simple scheduling inside your dashboard itself, you can use the cache inside the dashboard itself. The cache inside the dashboard is process specific though, and you can't share that data across dashboards or with like APIs or scripts. The new PSU cache stuff is actually a server level cache, which means that you can access that cache data in APIs, automation, and dashboards. So you could potentially have a script that was scheduled, collecting data, and then you could use that data in your dashboard or in your API. So it kind of depends on if you want some like visualization into the job itself. So if you want to see, your caching job running and go to the jobs table and see that it's run or when it last ran, that kind of thing, I would suggest definitely doing it that way. But if you wanted to kind of like isolate it just to the dashboard, it is possible to kind of do it the old way with new UD endpoint.
Okay, and then I can pass it to the new UD dashboard.
Yep.
Or okay.
Yep, exactly. And you can just use the cache scope directly inside Universal Dashboard too.
Okay. Yeah, because I at the moment I call a REST API to retrieve some data from a database, and the first time when I load the dashboard, the waiting time is like half a second or so, and then the other websites are responsive again. So like this one call to pre-cache the data, and I then call the cache scope and save it inside. Is that I think that's a good way to use the new UD endpoint. I think to call that first and then pass it to new UD dashboard. I think would be a good solution.
Yep.
Okay. Then you wrote something in your documentation about the app bar override, because if I try to name my pages, I think I can't put a space inside the name of the page. and I hope to do that via the app override. I copied the code inside of the of the dashboard, and then I get an error. So can you explain a little bit about this problem or about?
I mean, it sounds like we need to add some flexibility in there. I think one of the problems is kind of how the V3 pages are built. There are some issues that we're looking at, kind of, I don't know, streamlining the behavior there, because if you have like a custom navigation bar and you actually click on it, it's going to collapse that navigation bar and go to the new page. And I don't know, there's just some weird stuff that I think we need to clean up in terms of the app bar and the navigation in V3. We were trying to make it like really customizable, but we kind of sacrificed simplicity and like introduced some issues when we did that. So we're kind of like backtracking a little bit to make it simpler, so that you could, for example, named pages with spaces works, and like navigation doesn't collapse when you click and that kind of thing. So there's some cleanup we need to do there. So I'm aware of these issues. It's just kind of getting on top of that.
Another question that would be, I think, for all in this meetup, how can people contribute to your work, or can we help out you on something like documentation or so? Where can
documentation
we go
is
from that.
Is always welcome. I would say the other thing that I'm really looking for is those custom components that I started playing with. We have people that are like doing the same thing over and over again. So if you do have anything that you've built that you can contribute to that repository, like a form that creates a ServiceNow ticket, or like a Active Directory password reset or something like that, that kind of thing is super helpful, because otherwise what happens is it's a lot of people don't have good examples, and it's answering the same questions over and over again, like how do I implement this thing that other people are doing. So I would say those are the two huge things that people can help.
Okay, and where is the docs repository? Is it a GitHub link or?
Yep. So if you go to docs.powershelluniversal.com, there should be a link there that says like edit on GitHub, and then there's just a GitHub repository, and they're all markdown files.
Okay. So standard pull request.
Yep.
Thing. Okay. The other thing that you aren't talked in your demo is the stuff with roles authentication. Can you elaborate something on that?
Yeah, sure. So so we kind of support a lot of different authentication methods. First, we have forms-based authentication, which you saw me using, but we also support things like Windows Single Sign-On, OpenID Connect, and WS Federation. And once you set that up, you kind of have access to our role-based access system, where we actually have PowerShell scripts that run as you log in. And what they'll do is they'll evaluate kind of the information that we received from your authentication provider. So for example, if you're logging with Windows Single Sign-On, we get a lot of information about the groups that you're a member of. And then from there, you can assign roles based on that group membership. And then, so right now it's a little manual process. You definitely have to write some like code yourself to determine which roles a user will, find themselves in. And then once they're in a particular role, what you can do is you can assign roles throughout the product in various places. So for example, if you have an API that's authenticated, you could lock it down to only, an administrator role actually having access to that API. And the same goes for dashboards and even pages on dashboards. And then, like I said, where we're kind of focused next is custom roles for jobs and making that a better experience, so that you can kind of assign roles to view jobs and run jobs and that kind of thing. So
if I'm trying to connect my dashboard to Azure AD, so the OIDC, does that change something of the code? So do you also get the group membership through this provider? Or
Yep. So there is some configuration I think you need to do inside Azure for Azure to actually return the group membership as part of like the token that it returns during the OpenID Connect process. But it is possible. Yeah.
okay, perfect. Because that if we want to bring it to our customers, then I think we have to do that. Other thing, I've tried to host it in an Azure Web App through a container. That worked really well. But the thing that I was asking me if I have some third-party PowerShell modules, like I think DBA tools or so on, do I have to add that to the container, I think, and make my own image, or do you have some tricks around that?
Yeah, you could do the contain or make your own image based on ours, or I mean, the other trick is we have triggers that you can run when the dashboard or the server starts, which you could trigger a script to install modules, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But yeah, we don't really have a great way to just like have a manifest of modules to install or something. That might not be a bad idea to actually implement something simple.
And I think my last question about around that is PowerShell Universal does have REST API. You can you do everything with the REST API that you just showed us in the UI?
Everything with the REST API.
For example, trigger a script from outside PowerShell Universal or something like that, or trigger a REST API from outside or so.
Can you do it in the UI?
So
you mean?
if I have another program that wants to trigger PowerShell Universal and start another script and take the return values of that, you can do that via the PowerShell Universal UI.
You can do it. Yeah, there is right. So you can do it. You can do it during the UI, but we also have a REST. We call it the management REST API, which allows you to kind of start jobs and that kind of thing using REST. So you don't have to develop the REST API yourself. It's already available. So you could actually have a different system, call into PowerShell Universal, start a job, and then return that data back. And if that system can run PowerShell, then you can actually use the PowerShell Universal PowerShell module, and that will call the REST API for you, and you can just use PowerShell commandlets.
Okay, so you just have to authenticate with a token. And then you can call it through the commandlets. Okay, that's also a good thing. Okay, and I've played with that already, but I don't know if it's possible. If I want to call a script from PowerShell Universal Dashboard through, I want to call an automation script from PowerShell Universal Dashboard and get the data back. Is that possible?
It is. It's more difficult than it needs to be right now. The Universal module is loaded into all Universal dashboards, so you can use those Universal commandlets. But the way they work is they still use the REST API. So you still need to like have an app token, and you have to have the URL correct, that kind of thing. That said, we do have a parameter that you can use to grant an app token automatically inside a dashboard based on the user's roles. So then you don't really have to manage the app token, and we try to like get the URL correct. But if you're behind a proxy server, not a proxy server, but like a proxy like IIS, the URL is going to be incorrect. So there is some manual configuration there. So it's possible. It's definitely possible. But like I said, there's a couple steps kind of thing. What we're hoping to do is simplify that and kind of make those commandlets work internally, so they don't have to use REST API. But again, that's like another kind of big lift for us, just because they're all built around the REST API right now.
Yeah, the best thing would if I call that script and think you can do it with NewUD Dynamic to render the output of that script inside of the dashboard. That would be a great thing. I don't use it as much because I only have the free license, and that I think you can call 25 scripts per day, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
I have to
that's
get
the
the full
limit.
license to run unlimited things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for answering the questions.
Yeah.
Do any one of the attendees, participants, have any other questions?
Sorry, I've just got one more for Adam. It's regarding the forums. Actually, I was just thinking, would that be a good place to like add a new thing for modules where people could just go, hey, I really need this, and then to get other people contribute towards the module, if you could add it to the forum.
Yeah, sure. I think that's like definitely the best touch point for the community. So if you think it makes sense to have like a category for like a, I don't know, almost like a ask the UD developer if they've built this already kind of thing. That might be a good idea. Yeah.
A bit like your samples that you've kindly included with the plugin on code, but to have like a bunch of useful samples there. I'm thinking for people who are new to the whole world of UD and like PowerShell Universal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that'd be great. We do have a cookbook section that I used to contribute to whenever I'd like, I came up with this cool thing, and I would make a cookbook post, but I really haven't kept up with that. But that might be a good thing too. But yeah, I'm definitely open. Anything to make it easier for people to get started. I think that's one of the hardest things with this is there's so much you can do. It's really powerful, but it can be very complicated and kind of overwhelming, I think, when someone first opens it.
Yeah. That'd be a good thing that you make YouTube videos about the features, the different features. So Adam has a YouTube channel also. If you find him on YouTube, I think Adam Driscoll is the YouTube channel name. He has there published a lot of things around PowerShell Universal, and has also his series PS Module Monday, I think, published there. Yeah, very interesting. So definitely have a look at it. So I think I will leave it in the meetup notes for the participants to check out if they want. Yeah, so that leads me to my last question, because the other Adam talked about something. So how to get in touch with you? Best would be about around Twitter or forum, or how's the best way?
Yeah, if you have like specific questions about Universal and that kind of thing, I would definitely say open a forum post first. If you just want to like touch base on Twitter, I'm definitely accessible there. And then if you are a Universal customer, I'm starting to push them towards my support channel, which is support@ironmansoftware.com, just so we can track that a lot better. So yeah, that's kind of the three places that I would go if you have questions for Universal.
And I think we talked about that off recording. How is the licensing of PowerShell Universal? How are the different plans, or what plans do we need to buy or so? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, sure. So we have kind of 3 plans right now. We've been kind of bouncing around on licensing, to be completely honest. What we have right now is the free offering. Has some limitations around how many APIs you can create and how many jobs you can run, and you can't set up like authentication for dashboards or APIs. But you can set up authentication for like the admin console. That's kind of the free offering. And then we have like a light offering that I can't exactly remember exactly what that is, but it has the ability to run as many jobs as you want. I think it has some limitation on APIs and concurrent users. Yeah. And then finally, we have either a perpetual or subscription-based full license that lets you just have access to the whole platform. And all those are based on like a per server licensing model. So each instance of PowerShell Universal will need a license. So one thing I do want to mention is I will say that our light offering is not purchased very often, and we're considering kind of simplifying it, maybe having like a single license model, and giving away more in the free model kind of thing. So we're still kind of playing with ideas. We just want to make sure that like there's so much cool community around PowerShell Universal and Universal Dashboard that we want to have, you want the community members to have access to the platform and not, penny pinch everyone for everything. So that's kind of what we're trying to figure out right now.
Good thing. Okay. Good. If there are no more questions, I think we can call it a day. And
cool. Well, yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I would thank Adam for presenting. Yeah. So no more questions, I think. Yeah. Adam, do you have any questions? The other Adam?
I'm all good. Thanks very much for your time.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. You unmuted yourself, so okay. Good. Then we can call it a day if no one has any questions. Thank you, Adam, for presenting.
Yeah, thank you.
And yeah.
Yeah, and we'll be in touch, I'm sure.
Yeah, I hope so, because I think I will call you again for PowerShell Protect or PowerShell Pro Tools or so. We can talk about that a bit. Yeah. Then everyone have a nice evening or have a nice wherever you are.
Yeah,
and thank you very much. And
all right, yeah,
bye-bye.
bye.